already had a vibrant academic past. After completing her Bachelor's of Science in Psychology at Duke, with a concentration in neuroscience and a minor in physics, Parker was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, where she received her Master's of Science in International and Comparative Education and an MBA. She then received a doctorate in education from Harvard before joining us here at Stanford. Parker's thesis work at Oxford centered on the development of a program called Coach for College. Coach for College is a service learning program that brings together U.S. student athletes and Vietnamese university students to teach academics, sports, and life skills at summer camps to children in rural Vietnam. Parker has raised more than $2 million in funding for the program since 2008, including a commitment of funding from the University of Michigan. Parker's extensive, well, actually they haven't paid up yet, so if you guys have any influence on that process. Parker's extensive training in advanced statistics at Harvard and her commitment to psychological theory have been fundamental pillars in her research with the Coach for College program. This program will be the focus of Parker's talk, so without further ado, if you'll join me in welcoming her.
So my interest is in using social psychological interventions that have shown to be effective in the U.S. and seeing if they can be adapted for developing countries. So far, I've only done it in the context of this program I've developed, but in the future, it'd be also great to test other kinds of interventions. So broadly, I'm going to talk about how and why I started the program, the broad research themes that motivated my research, some about the intervention itself, and then 3 research studies that I've done to date. It would be great to get feedback on kind of new directions or lines of research at the end, because I've only done just a few studies so far. So this really emerged. I was a student athlete in college on the tennis team, and I felt that my experience was very different from regular college students. I was playing sports 4 hours a day, going to tournaments, trying to get by academically, and as a result, I wasn't able to study abroad, do a lot of service, kind of have the full college experience. And talking with other student athletes, I realized this was a larger systemic problem that they were facing. After graduation, I had the chance to go to Vietnam and Belize for the first time and saw how the youth there often did not have the kinds of resources, opportunities that I and other student athletes had access to. And then given my major in psychology, I was interested in adapting psychological principles for social change. And then I had this fellowship when I graduated where 20% of my time was devoted to developing my own personal project. And so this is what came out of it. The reason it got started was I was able to make a presentation to the provost at my university, and he took a chance on me and gave me seed funding to start it, along with the chancellor at our rival institution, UNC Chapel Hill. So with that, as well as the State Department grant, I was able to start the program the first year. So when you look at these 3 groups, U.S. college athletes, middle school students, and college students in developing countries, you might think they have very little in common. As I was thinking about it that first year, I realized that they each had strengths that could potentially benefit the others. So athletes tend to be very goal-driven. They work hard, they overcome setbacks, and I think these are really valuable lessons, sometimes in collectivist cultures where those are not explicitly emphasized in the school system. At the same time, middle school students in places like Vietnam, they have a lot to teach the American athletes. They live in farming families, they make $200 to $300 US a year, but they're very happy despite that. And I think that can be a very powerful lesson for a lot of the Americans. So when I was thinking about these groups, I was also trying to think of what are some common outcomes that might be valuable for them all to obtain. And so the first thought I had was kind of how can we foster this approach towards challenging meaningful goals and develop a sense of purpose? This was something that I especially thought was important at times of transition. For example, for student athletes, for most of them, are not going to be professionals, but they need a new identity that no longer depends on sports once they graduate from college. At the same time, I thought it would be important to develop motivation, efficacy to achieve those goals, and then finally, a broader perspective on the world. So for example, Vietnamese youth often live in these rural communities where all they know is their neighbors. They don't really know what's beyond that world. Similarly, student athletes are from often a very sheltered environment where most of their friends are fellow athletes, used to having treatment at an elite level. And so that was something I felt that could be addressed through this program. In terms of some mechanisms, the first set has to do with how do you foster positive relationships among people who would not normally interact. And so one thing I thought of was, well, can they work together towards a common goal? Like, can we have college students from Vietnam with US athletes working together to help youth? So that might be a way for them to form these deep relationships that they might otherwise not form. In addition, like making sure they had equal status. So in the program, Vietnamese college students are really effective in terms of in-group role models for the students and bilingual translators, but then Americans also have sports expertise and then native English-speaking ability. So they each have something to contribute. And then third, I was thinking about how can we foster an experience that is optimally challenging. So it's not too hard that it produces anxiety, but it's not too easy that it produces boredom. And so I tried to think of ways to design the program so that people would see the value of learning and reframe ways that they thought about themselves and what was possible for them to achieve. So people often ask me why I started this in Vietnam, and I think there are a number of factors. First was I had a faculty advisor in university who introduced me to the country, and she had been there to teach English for a few times. So I went with her the first summer and met a variety of different people in the country. I've since been to Vietnam 17 times. I've become very familiar with it. And as I did more research, I realized that a lot of their educational dropout issues occur in the middle school years. And so given that, I thought that they might really benefit from interventions that focused on social psychology. I also thought it would be a good country to bring student athletes who have very little international experience, because it's a very safe, stable country, but has much different culture and living conditions. And then I also knew that it had a uniform education system, so if the program could work at one school, it's likely to be expanded to other locations. So the two provinces you see there, Da Nang and Hào Giang, are where we currently operate, and I hope to be able to expand the program to other sites in other countries in the future. So since 2008, we've had 7 different programs in the form of 43-week camps. Each camp serves 120 middle school students and 16 college students. We've had 2,800 middle school youth, but some of them have participated multiple times. And we've had approximately 300 athletes from America and 326 from Vietnam. These are the universities that have sent students so far. I hope to be able to expand it nationally, and this is kind of the way the program is funded, is by the universities that pay for student athletes to participate in the program. So as you can see, the program affects these 3 groups of students. So far, I've only focused on the Vietnamese adolescents in my academic research, but in the future, I'd also like to focus on how it benefits the Vietnamese college students and US athletes. So I had a number of ideas that were influential to me. One was this idea of a psychological engineer. I didn't know about it at the time, but 3 years later I read about that, and that really resonated with me. Someone that can know psychological theory, use it to design interventions, but then also know how to evaluate it and improve the intervention as a result. Second is most of my training has been in statistics. I studied with a statistics professor at Harvard, and now I'm learning more about social psychology here. I'd like to be able to bridge the two, to use theory from social psychology with the techniques of economics. Also, using social psychology to solve social problems. I thought that was a very powerful idea that I wanted to implement through this program. And the idea that psychological beliefs can be very key mediators for the way the environment impacts longer-term outcomes. So another idea was small wins. It was something that was first written about in the 1980s in American Psychologist. And it's the idea that if you focus so much on the scale of a problem, it can be overwhelming, lead to inertia. But if you focus on something small, tangible that you can control, it might be a nudge that starts this larger positive recursive cycle. And then again, this idea of optimal challenge, designing something that is just at the level that's needed for a person's level of skills. So there's 2 ways to look at this research, one from a social psychology perspective, one from development economics. So we know that there's various interventions that have been successful in reducing the achievement gap, improving resilience, physical health, and they do this by a small nudge that either removes a critical barrier and then launches a positive recursive cycle. My interest is in whether these interventions can also work in contexts where the poverty is much greater. So kids that are making a few $100s a year as opposed to 15 to 20,000 a year. Whether they can also be effective in different kinds of cultures, and also when they're embedded in real-world programs with all the complications that arise from that. I also had the chance to learn some about development economics, and if you read most of the research in developing countries, it tends to be dominated by economists, and mostly they focus on the impact of school inputs, like what's the added value of adding textbooks or teachers or additional schools. And I think this is valuable, but it's not the whole story. I think often psychology is seen as not something that's important, or it's too difficult to measure by economists. And so I would like to be able to make the case that it's both important as an outcome and as a potential mediator for a lot of these long-term effects. And also that timing is very important. Most of the interventions I've read in economics focus on primary school only, and I think it's also important to consider key transitions and also early adolescence. So I'm going to talk briefly about the intervention. I'm happy to go into more detail at the end about any of the components. So when I first designed this, I started by thinking from a person perspective about what are the problems that low-income rural youth face. And as you might imagine, poverty that they face is a multiply determined problem. They're from their parents are often farmers or small shopkeepers. They've only gone to middle school or high school, so it's in many ways a cycle that's difficult to escape. The education system is governed a lot by exams. So, if you don't score well enough in exams, you just can't get into the next level. It's not like you can write essays or get teacher recommendations to help if you don't have good test scores. So I knew that these factors were leading to these other outcomes, but one thing I wanted to test was, were they also affecting psychological factors? Were they doing this by lowering their goals or their motivation or their efficacy? Was that at least in part an explanation for why these outcomes were hard for them to obtain? And so I approached this from a small wins perspective. I was trying to develop a program that would create small wins for individuals. So in the context of a program like this, for example, girls often don't play sports in Vietnam, but if you can teach them over the course of 3 weeks to serve a volleyball over the net, that might be something that's very empowering for them and that leads them to try other types of challenges. In addition, the program as a whole can be thought of as a small win because in a country like Vietnam, it's a communist country, a lot of bureaucracy. If you tried to implement a change in the formal system, it would often probably get bogged down. And so my idea was introduce a summer program that doesn't have to go through the same regulations. It's seen as non-threatening. And then once you have it, it can lead to these larger indirect effects. So government officials might see the potential of low-income students. Teachers might see the different methodologies we're using, adopt some of them. Vietnamese students might be more motivated to become teachers or work in nonprofits, things like that. So I have 3 points for intervention. First is early adolescence. I really wanted to focus on the 6th to 9th grade years, which is when middle school occurs in Vietnam. Second, during the summer, especially for low-income students, that they're often subject to summer learning loss if they don't practice subjects like science and language. And then third, I wanted to see if I could adapt some social psychological interventions for the rural Vietnamese context. So this is my theory of change. I started with long-term outcomes I wanted to obtain, helping them develop greater well-being, greater jobs, and then higher education, helping them go to high school and college or before they would drop out during middle school. And then I was hoping to do this by first impacting their psychological beliefs about education, improving the goals that they set, their levels of motivation, their efficacy, and then their ability to regulate their behavior to achieve those goals. So then I'm going to talk briefly just about 4 categories of strategies that I use to try to achieve these goals. First is something I just call psychological techniques, so instructing them in how to set long-term goals, short-term goals. There's some research about when you expose people to different cultures or diverse perspectives, it can lead to greater creativity and divergent thinking. And so that's one of the values of having Americans as well as Vietnamese volunteer teachers. And then talking about growth mindset, social belonging, attributions for failure as well. The second set of approaches has to do with helping them see learning as more engaging and more fun, and as well as easier to understand. In my interviews with a lot of the kids, one of the reasons they drop out is because they feel bored or it's too abstract during school, which emphasizes rote learning a lot. And so I wanted to develop academic classes that would enable them to see academics as both exciting but also more tangible. So one of the ways we do that is by applied learning using sports. So for example, in a physics class, they might run outside, calculate their time, and then come back and learn the formula for speed and acceleration. So it becomes much more tangible to them than during the normal school year. The third set of strategies is around people. The Vietnamese college students are often from the same types of low-income rural communities as the kids, and so Because they're there in the camp and they're telling their personal stories, it helps the youth feel that people like them can also go to college.